You wake up and reach for your phone before your eyes have fully adjusted to the light. There isn't a voice commanding you to do it. No soldier stands outside your door. No law forces your hand. Yet somehow, before your first conscious thought has even formed, you've already entered a world that knows what you will look at, what will make you angry, what will make you laugh, what you might buy this afternoon, and perhaps even who you'll become 5 years from now. That realization is unsettling. Not because someone is watching every move you make, but because no single person has to. For most of history, people feared dictators with recognizable faces. Kings, emperors, tyrants whose portraits hung in government buildings, and whose speeches echoed through crowded squares. Power had a name. It had an address. You knew where it lived. But what happens when power becomes invisible? What happens when control no longer arrives through fear, but through convenience? When it feels less like oppression and more like personalization? You probably don't notice it during the ordinary moments. When a video appears at exactly the right time. When an advertisement seems to read your mind. When your news feed confirms everything you already believe. When your music, your entertainment, your shopping, even your friendships begin to feel strangely effortless. It feels like freedom. And maybe that's exactly why it's so difficult to question. Because the most effective forms of influence rarely announce themselves. They don't kick down the front door. They simply leave another door open until you walk through it willingly. Have you ever stopped to wonder how many of your decisions actually feel like your own? Not just the obvious ones, but the tiny choices that quietly shape your life. Why you clicked that headline, why you stayed awake another hour scrolling, why certain opinions suddenly felt undeniable, why someone you've never met became a hero or an enemy. It's tempting to believe that we're too intelligent to be manipulated. That manipulation only works on other people. But psychology has been revealing a far more uncomfortable truth for decades. The human mind wasn't built for the world we've created. Our brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in small tribes where information traveled slowly, relationships were personal, and survival depended on paying attention to immediate threats. We became experts at reading faces, detecting social approval, avoiding exclusion, and responding quickly to patterns. Those instincts kept our ancestors alive. Today, they keep us refreshing our screens. Every notification whispers the possibility of social acceptance. Every recommendation promises certainty. Every endless feed exploits the brain's ancient attraction to novelty. The machinery has changed beyond recognition, but the operating system inside our skulls is almost identical to the one carried by hunter-gatherers wandering across ancient landscapes. Technology didn't invent our vulnerabilities, it industrialized them. And that's where the story becomes far bigger than smartphones or social media. Because data is not merely information, data is prediction. The more someone understands your habits, the less they need to persuade you directly. Instead of forcing behavior, they can gently shape the environment around you until your preferred choice becomes the most likely one. Behavioral scientists sometimes refer to this as choice architecture. Rather than removing freedom, you redesign the landscape in which freedom operates. Picture two rivers flowing downhill. Neither is forced. But one has been quietly redirected for miles before reaching the valley. By the time the water arrives, its destination feels inevitable. Human decisions work in surprisingly similar ways. The frightening part isn't that someone controls every action. The frightening part is that tiny influences accumulate over thousands of moments until an entirely different version of your life begins to emerge. History offers a warning that few people recognize. When we think about dictatorships, our minds usually travel to the 20th century. Massive rallies, military uniforms, secret police, loud propaganda blaring from radios, citizens terrified of saying the wrong thing. Those regimes relied on limited information. They couldn't monitor everyone. They couldn't predict individual behavior with precision. Instead, they controlled entire populations using blunt instruments. Censorship, violence, intimidation, fear. It was expensive. It was inefficient. And eventually, it often collapsed under its own weight. Now ask yourself something unsettling. If those governments had possessed the ability to understand every citizen individually, to know their fears, desires, relationships, personalities, political leanings, emotional triggers, and daily routines, would they have needed so much violence? Or could they have achieved similar results with far less resistance? The question isn't purely historical anymore. Because today, billions of people voluntarily carry sophisticated tracking devices in their pockets. Not because they were forced, because they're useful. Maps save time, music lifts our mood. Maps connect us instantly. Photos preserve memories. None of these technologies are inherently dangerous. In fact, they've improved countless lives. The deeper issue lies elsewhere. Every convenience leaves a trail. Every search reveals curiosity. Every purchase exposes priorities. Every pause while watching a video says something about attention. Every heartbeat measured by a smartwatch. Every late-night search when anxiety refuses to let you sleep. Each piece seems meaningless on its own. But together? Together they become something astonishing. A portrait more intimate than many of your closest friends could ever paint. You might think privacy means hiding secrets. But privacy has never been only about secrets. Privacy protects the unfinished version of yourself. The version that's still experimenting. Still changing. Still uncertain. Without private spaces, identity becomes something performed instead of discovered. Long before algorithm existed, philosophers wrestled with this idea. The Stoics believed freedom began inside the mind. External circumstances could become oppressive, but true autonomy depended upon governing your own judgments. Centuries later, existential philosophers argued that becoming fully human required choosing consciously instead of drifting through inherited expectations. Different eras, different languages, yet both pointed toward the same fragile truth. Freedom is less about having unlimited options than about remaining aware of why you're choosing. And awareness is surprisingly difficult. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades exploring how our minds constantly rely on shortcuts. We believe we're carefully reasoning through every decision, but much of daily life unfolds automatically. Fast thinking saves energy, yet it also makes us remarkably predictable. Predictability is valuable, not only to psychologists, not only to marketers, to anyone seeking influence. If you can anticipate someone's next move with enough accuracy, you no longer need to control them directly. You simply prepare the path they'll most likely take. That subtle distinction changes everything, because coercion creates resistance. Prediction often doesn't. The philosopher Michel Foucault once described how societies gradually shifted away from public displays of punishment toward quieter systems of observation. The awareness of being watched could influence behavior even when no one was actively watching. Today, something even stranger has emerged. You don't need surveillance towers overlooking prison yards. People carry them voluntarily. And unlike older forms of surveillance, these systems aren't only observing behavior, they're learning from it. Every interaction becomes feedback. Every prediction becomes slightly more accurate. Every accurate prediction generates more data. The cycle strengthens itself, sometimes without anyone fully understanding where it ultimately leads. This isn't a conspiracy orchestrated by a single mastermind sitting behind a curtain. Reality is far more complex, and perhaps more unsettling. Countless companies optimize for engagement. Governments seek security. Political campaigns pursue persuasion. Artificial intelligence optimizes efficiency. Each system follows its own incentives. Yet together, they produce an ecosystem where human attention has become one of the most valuable resources on Earth. And once attention becomes a resource, the competition to capture it never truly ends. The strange thing about attention is that most of us don't notice when we've lost it. You don't wake up one morning and decide that your inner world no longer belongs entirely to you. It happens so gradually that it feels like nothing is changing at all. A recommendation here, a notification there, one more article, one more video, one more outrage that disappears as quickly as it arrived, only to be replaced by another. Days become months. Months become years. Then one afternoon you catch yourself repeating an opinion you never consciously formed. You can't remember where you first heard it. You only know that it now feels like your own. That should make all of us pause. Because ideas have always spread from person to person. That's nothing new. Stories, religions, political movements, and revolutions have shaped civilizations for thousands of years. But never before has there been a system capable of learning, in real time, which version of reality is most likely to capture the attention of each individual person. The village storyteller had one story for everyone. The newspaper printed one front page. The evening news delivered one broadcast. Now, billions of people inhabit billions of slightly different realities. No two feeds are exactly alike. No two digital worlds are identical. At first glance, this seems like progress. Why shouldn't information be personalized? Why shouldn't technology adapt to our interests instead of forcing everyone into the same mold? The question isn't whether personalization is useful. It clearly is. The question is what happens when personalization becomes so precise that it begins shaping identity itself. Carl Jung believed that much of human behavior is driven by forces hidden beneath conscious awareness. We like to imagine ourselves as rational beings making independent decisions. Yet beneath the surface lies an ocean of impulses, fears, desires, and inherited instincts that quietly steer the ship. His idea of the shadow wasn't simply about darkness. It was about everything we fail to recognize within ourselves. And today, something remarkable has happened. Technology often recognizes our unconscious patterns before we do. It notices when our mood changes, when we're impulsive, when we're lonely, when we're bored, when we're likely to spend money, when we're emotionally vulnerable. Not because a machine understands human sufferings the way another person does, but because patterns emerge wherever enough data exists. The algorithm doesn't need empathy. Prediction is enough. That changes the relationship between human beings and technology in a profound way. For centuries, tools extended our physical abilities. The wheel helped us move farther. The telescope helped us see farther. The microscope revealed worlds too small for our eyes. Now our tools are beginning to extend and influence our minds. They remember what we forget. They recommend what we haven't considered. They filter what we notice. Eventually, they may know what we will choose before we ourselves become aware of the decision. When was the last time you sat alone in complete silence? No music, no podcast, no scrolling, no messages. Just your own thoughts. For many people, that silence has become uncomfortable, not because silence changed, because we've become strangers to it. Ancient philosophers often retreated into solitude, not to escape the world, but to understand themselves before the world defined them. Marcus Aurelius wrote personal reflections that were never intended for public eyes. Buddhist monks spent years observing the movement of their own minds. Indigenous traditions across continents treated silence not as emptiness, but as a place where wisdom could finally be heard. Contrast that with modern life. The average day is filled with interruptions so frequent that uninterrupted thinking has become almost revolutionary. If every spare moment is occupied, when does the deeper self have an opportunity to speak? Perhaps this is one of the greatest paradoxes of the digital age. We're more connected than any generation before us. Yet many people struggle to hear their own inner voice. That voice is fragile. It doesn't shout, it whispers beneath layers of distraction. And distraction has become one of the defining forces of our civilization. Not because someone necessarily wants to distract you for malicious reasons. Attention is simply profitable. If thousands of companies compete for the same finite resource, your awareness, then every improvement in capturing attention becomes economically valuable. The result isn't a single villain, it's an environment. Just as fish rarely notice the water surrounding them, we rarely notice the systems shaping our attention because we've lived inside them for so long. History has shown that power evolves. The Roman Empire projected power through military conquest. Medieval kingdoms relied on hereditary authority. Industrial nations mastered factories, infrastructure, and mass production. The 20th century became the age of broadcasting, where influence flowed from a few powerful institutions toward millions of passive audiences. The 21st century is becoming something entirely different. Influence no longer flows in one direction. It adapts, it learns, it experiments. Artificial intelligence doesn't become more effective because it grows emotionally wiser. It becomes more effective because every interaction teaches it something. Every click becomes a lesson. Every hesitation becomes information. Every correction becomes training. In a strange way, humanity is collectively educating the systems that increasingly organize modern life, not through classrooms, through daily behavior. Every search query, every photograph uploaded, every route taken through a city, every sentence typed into a chatbot, piece by piece, we are creating maps of ourselves. And maps can be used in many different ways. A map can guide someone home, or it can guide someone toward control. Technology itself isn't moral or immoral. A hammer can build a house or destroy one. The real question has always been, who holds it? And what incentives guide their actions? But there is another layer that often goes unnoticed. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't that someone else controls the hammer. Sometimes it's that we've forgotten we're holding one ourselves. Every time we accept convenience without reflection, every time we exchange another fragment of ourselves for a slightly easier experience, we participate in shaping the future. Not because individual choices determine history overnight, because civilizations are built from billions of ordinary decisions repeated every single day. Have you ever noticed how quickly habits become invisible? The first time you unlock your phone 100 times a day, it feels excessive. A month later, it feels normal. The first time an app finishes your sentence, it feels impressive. A year later, you barely notice. Humans possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. It's one of our greatest strengths. It's also one of our greatest vulnerabilities. We normalize almost everything. That includes freedom quietly shrinking around the edges. The most effective prison is often the one that doesn't feel like a prison at all. Not because the doors are locked, because no one wants to leave. This is where the conversation becomes deeply personal. It stops being about governments, or corporations, or artificial intelligence. It becomes about consciousness itself. Because awareness has always been humanity's greatest defense against unconscious influence. Every major philosophical tradition returns to this idea in one form or another. Know yourself. Observe your thoughts, question your assumptions, pay attention to your attention. Simple advice? Incredibly difficult to practice. Especially in a world designed to interrupt it. I'm curious where you stand this. Do you think technology is giving us more freedom than ever before? Or do you think we're gradually trading away parts of ourselves without realizing it? There isn't a simple right or wrong answer, and that's exactly what makes this conversation worth having. I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments, because the way each of us sees this question may reveal just as much about ourselves as it does about the technology around us. Because perhaps the greatest illusion of all is believing that the future will be decided only by engineers, politicians, or billion-dollar companies. The future is also being shaped inside millions of ordinary minds. One choice at a time. The deeper you look, the more the question begins to change. Maybe the greatest threat isn't that machines will become conscious. Maybe it's that human beings will become increasingly unconscious, not asleep in the literal sense, but moving through life on autopilot, reacting instead of reflecting, consuming instead of questioning, responding instead of choosing. That kind of unconsciousness has always existed. Human beings have always been creatures of habit. We rely on routines because they save mental energy. We repeat familiar behaviors because uncertainty is exhausting. The brain is constantly searching for shortcuts, trying to predict what comes next so it can conserve resources. From an evolutionary perspective, that efficiency was a gift. In the modern world, it can become a vulnerability. Every habit creates a pattern. Every pattern becomes predictable, and every predictable pattern can be influenced. This is why the conversation about data isn't ultimately about technology. It's about human nature. Data is simply a mirror. The unsettling part is what that mirror reveals. It reveals that our identities are not nearly as fixed as we'd like to believe. We often describe ourselves as if we are complete, independent individuals with stable beliefs and carefully considered values. But psychology paints a far more fluid picture. Our moods change our judgments. Our environment changes our behavior. The people around us change our opinions. Even the order in which information reaches us can influence what we believe to be true. That doesn't mean we're weak. It means we're human. For centuries, philosophers wrestled with one of the oldest questions imaginable. What does it actually mean to be free? Most people instinctively think of freedom as the absence of external restraint. The ability to travel where you want, speak your mind, choose your career, love who you love. Those freedoms matter profoundly. But there is another kind of freedom that's much harder to protect. The freedom from invisible manipulation. The freedom to encounter your own thoughts before someone else arranges them for you. The freedom to discover who you are, instead of gradually becoming what an optimization system predicts you'll become. That kind of freedom has never depended on politics alone. It has always depended on awareness. Nietzsche warned that people who fail to create their own values often end up living according to values they never consciously chose. Buddhist philosophy teaches that attachment and unconscious craving quietly shape our suffering. Modern neuroscience describes something remarkably similar through different language, showing how much of our behavior originates beneath conscious awareness, before the rational mind constructs a story explaining it afterward. Different traditions, different centuries. Yet they all circle the same mystery. How much of your life are you actually living deliberately? And how much is simply happening through you? Perhaps that's why solitude has become so valuable. Not because isolation is inherently good. Human beings need one another. We need love, friendship, conversation, and community. But every meaningful relationship begins with someone who has learned how to be present with themselves. If every quiet moment is immediately filled with stimulation, the inner landscape slowly becomes unfamiliar territory. Many people fear loneliness. But perhaps what we truly fear is meeting ourselves without distraction. There is an old story about travelers crossing a dense forest. As long as they kept walking without stopping, they believed they were making progress. Only when they climbed a hill and looked back did they realize they had been walking in circles for days. Life can feel remarkably similar. Movement is not always progress. Information is not always wisdom. Connection is not always understanding. And convenience is not always freedom. The challenge of the coming decades may not be learning how to live with artificial intelligence. It may be remembering what it means to remain deeply human in its presence. That doesn't require rejecting technology. History rarely rewards those who try to stop progress altogether. The printing press changed civilization. Electricity transformed daily life. The internet connected continents. Artificial intelligence will almost certainly reshape the world in ways we cannot fully predict. The question has never been whether new tools will emerge. The question is whether our wisdom grows as quickly as our power. Human history offers an uncomfortable pattern. Again and again, our ability to build has outpaced our ability to understand ourselves. We split the atom before resolving ancient conflicts. We connected billions of people before learning how to protect attention. We created systems capable of generating astonishing intelligence, while still struggling with loneliness, tribalism, fear and meaning. Technology accelerates whatever already exists inside us. If compassion guides it, extraordinary things become possible. If fear guides it, the consequences can be equally extraordinary. That's why the future cannot be reduced to a battle between humans and machines. The deeper struggle has always been within human consciousness itself. Every generation inherits a different test. Some generations were asked to defend freedom with courage. Others rebuilt nations from the ruins of war. Some confronted disease,